Ladies and gentlemen, this is an honor for me to welcome you at the fourth week program of UCAN University Lifelong Learning Open Fora 2020. And our topic for this week is bridging active citizenship and university lifelong learning. And it is a great honor for me to welcome and greet Professor Sir Alan TUCKETT, Professor of Education from Wolverhampton University. We are very glad that Alan has accepted our invitation to provide the masterclass. Before giving him the floor, I would like to welcome each and all participants to this week's program and the masterclass today. Very welcome to this event. May I ask you to change your little name tag, rename yourself with your first name, your city, the place where you live, and the country. And it will be easy to figure out where you're coming from. We know many of you who are around. In the picture of yours, you can find 3 dots, and if you click on the 3 dots, you can check the rolling button rename, and you can rename yourself very easily. But this is again optional. If you just don't want to do it, please don't do it. Before we start, our Executive Director, Carmen Royo, sent out a short message to you, and you can find it in the chat. And this is that we would like to ask you to go to menti.com and use the code 916360 and 7. And there is a question that we would like you to answer. What are the 3 terms which come to your mind when you listen to the expression active citizenship? And this, again, is optional to you. At the very end of the program, we would like to share with you the word cloud that we are trying to make through these responses gathered from you. So again, the question will be at menti.com. If you put the code 916360 and 7, what are the 3 terms which come to your minds when you listen to the expression active citizenship? Thank you for this. And let me again greet you and welcome you to this part of our week program. And at the very end of our session, I will just try to inform you about the rest of the week, who those people will be, and topics that you can follow with the Open Fora during the week from Monday till Friday. So this will be shared with you. But right now, let me just share something with you, and then I would like to give the floor to Professor TUCKETT. When we talk about active citizenship, it definitely brings in a number of issues. I just do not know why my screen is blank. Let me just go back to this. So what I would like to share with you is an interesting historic scope of our topic, because 100 years ago, a little bit more than 100 years, there was a very interesting publication in the UK, which was the 1919 report. And I just thought that the message of this document is clearly with us until today. Professor TUCKETT just mentioned that there was a recent commemoration of this very famous document in the UK. And you can also read the outcome of this retrospective and commemorating document. But the original document is very interesting for us. And let me just quote that, point number 5. The necessary conclusion is that adult education must not be regarded as a luxury for a few exceptional persons here and there, nor as a thing which concerns only a short span of early manhood, but that adult education is a permanent necessity and inseparable aspect of citizenship, and therefore should be both universal and lifelong. This was the document I just wanted to share with you in the context of today's elaboration on the topic. And another slide just to indicate that when we talk about active citizenship, we can also remind ourselves that some recent approaches to the topic itself have been provided through university researchers like Bart, Theo Jansen, Longworth, or Peter Jarvis, who put in immensely valuable focus and reasoning into this scope. And finally, let me just highlight UNESCO, and let me just go through this set of slides to that slide which is resonating UNESCO's role. By the way, you will find these slides uploaded at the Open Fora documents, is that we have here the Cape Town Statement, which is almost 20 years from now, to indicate connections in between lifelong learning, higher education, and that of active citizenship. And this document was very interestingly highlighted the role and responsibilities for higher education. And this is the reason why, in my understanding, Professor TUCKETT is together with us, and Ellen has put together valuable slides. And let me just give the floor to you, Ellen, and please start your masterclass to us. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So, Carmen, can I have the slides? The next one, please. Can we have the next one? About 5-6 years ago, ULLL discussed exactly this issue in its conference on universities and engagement. There's a very stimulating book edited by John Field and Schmidt-Peter and Alex Vaxenegger about it, in which they argue that, firstly, higher education is under a lot of pressure in countries to demonstrate its value to society, which picks up in a way on that quote from the 1919 report. But the thesis of that conference was that one major focus of the strategies has been an expansion of lifelong learning. And to summarize quickly what was argued then, and in a way you could see what I'm going to say today is no more than a restatement in a different way of that it means links with business and industry, critically strengthening communities, seeing what HE can do to strengthen communities, a focus on later life, on diversity in student groups, on partnerships with different stakeholders, and on organizational development and professional professionalization. I mean, you could argue that what they're arguing is that everything we do is relevant to active citizenship. But I think, to go back to that last slide of Balazs's, what I'm going to try and say is really related to that point that women and men need to be agents of their own histories. Can I have the next slide, please? Thomas Carlyle, I've put attributed to this because I can't find where the quote came from now, but he argued, and I like to repeat it, it doesn't really matter, it's the first duty of government to see that the people can think. I don't think that's universally honoured, but it is a very good frame for thinking about what constitutes active citizenship, one in which everyone's able to articulate their aspirations and thinking. And my own approach is as a disciple of Raymond Williams, can I have the next slide, who argued that at times of change, adults turn to learning in what I think of as a kind of rising hierarchy to understand what's happening, to make adjustments in the light of it, and most importantly, to help shape change. And that's what I think our work as adult educators critically involves. Now, can I have the next slide? The context of our meeting, of course, is we're meeting like this because the pandemic is among us. But the current discontents we have is that we're living in a world where we're not living in a way that our grandchildren or their children are likely to have lives remotely as comfortable as ours, where the ravages of globalization and its attendant inequalities have created extraordinary excess for a tiny few, and the intensification of marginalization and misery for many, where gender violence, xenophobia, racism are rampant, a rise of anti-democratic activity and populism, societies which are remarkably divided with an erosion of trust, and the emergence of fake news in the social media, and I'd like to go straight on to the next slide, where you really embodied in all of this is the experience of Trump over the last few years. In his every tweet, you see populism, fake news, challenges to democracy, a kind of feeling of a capturing people's alienation from the way our politics, certainly in the West, are organized, a kind of confirming that xenophobia is okay, racism's okay, fostering gender inequality. And none of those things will go away with Trump, if Trump ever gets to go away, as far as I can see. Can I have the next slide now, please? And then more challenges. The result of some of those issues, we've got significant structural unemployment, especially for young people and for older workers. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated that with economic downturns, probably nowhere as spectacular as in the country I live in, but nevertheless, a feature of many countries. And then technological change, artificial intelligence, robotics are all displacing jobs. I remember doing some work with the World Economic Forum when they were arguing that white-collar jobs would disappear even faster than blue-collar jobs did in the 1980s, where we need to manage the impact of aging societies and deal with mass migration. And in all of that, the aspiration is to secure informed debate in a context in which informed debate is not the norm of public discourse. Next one, please, Carmen. And then, and this I suppose is a key thing for our talk, the fact is universities are seen as part of the problem. So to argue we need university lifelong learning and that adult education is important to this, we need to recognize that one of the producers of the alienation of significant parts of many of our countries is the kind of meritocratic processes that examine and exclude through a pyramid, the top of which are universities, in which people with low or few or no educational qualifications experience shorter life expectancy, higher unemployment, greater poverty, much less likelihood to vote, distrust of elites, and a sense of a use of language in which our language seems like the language of the other, where education systems are designed to select success, but also, of course, select failure. My colleague, when I was at NIAS, Veronica McGivney, wrote a book capturing some of this at the very end of the 1980s. The book was called Educations for Other People, the kind of produced understanding for significant parts of populations that it's not part of everybody's ordinary choices in life. It feels like you go abroad by getting involved in education. So in a way, it's clear that the higher education finds it much easier and talking to and engaging with people who are already successful, and that neoliberal forms of working, measurement and accountability make engagement harder. Now that's quite a big chunk of problems. It's what Sandel has highlighted in his recent book on the triumph of meritocracy as a fundamental problem for us. That if everything is organized on the basis of merit and you seem to fail, that's saying you're a complete and total failure. Yet we can see that it's wider socioeconomic forces which marginalize people. So if that's some of the problems, can I move on, please, to the next slide? Then what do you do about it? Well, often educational responses have been led from outside higher education. And I've got 3 slides to illustrate some of this with civil rights from Highlander, gender equality and climate change. But and then, you know, even global citizenship education energies have come from a coalition, Euro-funded coalition, Bridge 47. Can I have the next slide, which is a picture really of Miles Horton and the argument, well, what can we do at Highlander Folk High School, inviting in the progenitors of the civil rights movement to workshop how to resist in a non-violent way, to make manifest the extraordinary offensive of the apartheid in the southern states. Horton argued we have to try to give our students an understanding of the world in which we live as a class-divided society and an idea of the world we'd like to have. That two-sided view is very much there in the thinking of Augusta Boal or Freire as well. If I can go on, I mean, just say the song We Shall Overcome was workshopped in a weekend at Highlander, building on an old folk tune. And the picture in the corner is Rosa Parks, and who sat on a bus as a way of triggering a pretty major social change. Can we go on? It's but grounded in adult education. And this is a different adult education exercise following one of the endless typhoons in the Philippines, where a whole community has not only been caught by mudslides, but also their whole village has basically become unlivable with, and they've needed to move away. And what everyone here is doing is ensuring that life is saved as far as possible. But the key issues for adult educators here is in a culture in which people visited graves in order to worship ancestors and so on. What do you do when you displace people far away? And what do you do about people left behind, people who are migrating, and people to whom you've migrated? And in each of those areas, there's dialogue, mutual understanding, listening at the core of what makes for the building of a new set of agreements and citizenships that are in offer there. And that's organized by a community adult education body in the Philippines. And then in my next slide, here are a group of revolutionary women, really. They're literacy workers who, an organization called Nirantar, who go into Uttar Pradesh, into highly divided communities to enlighten laws in India entitling women to access to literacy and education, the right to learn. But that's a right that's only exercisable village by village if village elders don't allow you to go to learn. And their focus is on Dalit women, used to be called untouchable women, and their work involves a good deal of resisting violence and oppression, and they're seen, what they're doing is enabling a law to be enacted, but of course they're transforming gender relations. And I mentioned gender violence earlier. It's a regular experience of their literacy work, quite unlike the literacy classes that I was responsible for early in my working life in Brighton, where there didn't seem to be any physical risk involved at all. Okay, can I move on to the next slide? So I'm finally getting to the point of what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is what can universities do? And I think I've got 10 points to make. The first one is that a key thing for us to do is to secure university strategic commitment to a civic engagement. That is, to university more widely. It's an argument made in the UK by an impressive report of the Civic University Commission last year, but a strategic commitment which needs to demonstrate a commitment to inclusiveness, diversity, and respect for difference, alongside the respect for excellence and the pursuit of the cutting edges of knowledge. A need to recognise the importance of place. We aren't in universities in mid-air. They're organisations with a relationship with the communities in which they're set, even if that relationship is through the securing of walls and the exclusion of people like Jude the Obscure from being able to join in. Making the work of higher education accessible to a wider society. You could see that as the traditional role of university lifelong learning departments. And that civic engagement isn't only the job of the lifelong learning department. That, in other words, our work can't only be outward facing. So that's the first of those points. Can I have the next slide, please? The second is not rocket science. It's best to work with agencies who are already engaged. Herbert Hinson's in the discussion today, and I'll be speaking later in the week. I mean, we'd be mad not to work with the kind of network of linking, if we're thinking working internationally for the moment, without working with a partner like the Deutsche Institute for Erwachsenenbildung. If you want access to target groups around age, around faith, refugee, working class communities, then there will be other people who are working effectively with them, who represent their interests, and we're far more likely to have an impact if we partner them. One illustration from Britain is the growth of the union learning movement. By linking trade unions with educational bodies in universities and the Workers' Education Association, you've seen the development and flowering of peer learning advice, of learning representatives in trade unions acting as promoters of participation, as translators, if you like, of what universities might be able to offer, and also raising aspirations for people to see themselves as capable of engagement and transformation. I think working with other people, I mean, one of the interesting things it throws up is the opportunity to work in different forms of action and response than we've been familiar with. There's a long history of creative university community education and engagement in the work from the 70s in the UK of Tom Lovett and the whole Lindeman's tradition in the United States and well, back to popular universities in early 20th century France. So working with other people then, of course, involves imaginatively developing trust together, using higher education resources and facilities, which for all our feeling broke, are always richer than those of the people we're working alongside. And in particular there to address the digital divide and the way in which our ever more sophisticated digital capacity alienates as well, excludes as well as includes. And in that area, my colleague at Wolverhampton, John Traxler, constantly argues that we need to focus more on mobile learning, that nearly everyone has a mobile phone, and that you can have far more effective reach if you design learning technologies with technologies that are really in wide use. So that was the second point. The third is working with partners who share common concerns. And in this, what I was thinking of in particular is the growth of the learning cities movement and also of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which highlight really that we can't work in our boxes. We have to work cross-sector, intersectorally, and to learn from each other's capacity. I mean, the metaphor I always use is it's all very well to put new toilets into an Indian village, but if people don't understand the issues around clean water that flow from them, they won't be very much used. Or much like, you know, people keeping coal in the bath when I was young, which was a long time ago. So the learning cities that struck me as vivid for us in this area were Cork, who use learning celebrations as a central dimension, Suwon, where there's a library within 10 minutes where everyone lives and a learning centre within 20 minutes, and where clearly the universities act as trainers and developers alongside all of that. The Cape Learning region, where we'll hear from South Africa tomorrow, where the challenge of the gap between urban and rural is so dramatic. And in Glasgow, where really over 20 years, you've seen the energies of a learning city built into the DNA of the civic organisation. So health agencies, unions, expert patient groups. And then perhaps easiest for academics really is generating research findings that will be of use for the people we're working with, working individually or in teams, and again across sectors. Can I have the next slide, please? So, I mean, I thought just the slide of Greta Thunberg really illustrates the point. You have someone there who has a global reach in terms of voice, but climate science research needs to be translated so that it beats on the pulses of the people and builds a momentum of change. And for that, we need good advocates, but advocates need up-to-date evidence accessibly presented. And some of the technologies of our work in higher education seem to me to have moved away from convincing, producing arguments accessible to and convincing a wider public, and focusing more on the rigors of peer group evaluation of our own activities, talking in a way to ourselves. So that involves a kind of culture shift, I think. Can I move on to the next one? And none of this is rocket science, as you would recognize. Listening and responding to community needs. It was one of the points made last time eucen looked at all of this. And in my working life, inspired by David Browning was sent out from Sheffield Hallam Northern College, just to listen to and talk to miners' communities. And I think he spent 3 years before anybody came to a class. But in the end, that institution felt owned by the working class communities of South Yorkshire. Tom Lovett, very similarly, working in Liverpool and in Belfast, sitting in pubs, capturing what interested people, thinking about what kind of learning might stimulate them. And Mike Newman wrote a wonderful book, Poor Cousin, about that kind of experience in London, about going out and finding oppositional groups, people wanting to make trouble and thinking, how can we make an adult education that worked for them? And finally, around popular planning, when one of my colleagues in South London recognised that, working with South Bank University and my adult education centre, recognised that in the pages of the Financial Times, people are always dreaming up bright wheezes for using buildings that emerge and so on. And there's a rather famous building, the Battersea Power Station, was closing down. We organised a popular planning, asking the people who lived within the area what they wanted to do with it, and created the most dynamic local activities. Nothing that happened fitted what we'd set out to do, but they were all purposeful initiatives that were revealed by the process of listening and responding to people. Then co-producing with the people you want to work with. So, I mean, there's a strong history of participative research, and GLACER, the organisation which Bud Hall in Victoria and Rajesh Tandon in Delhi coordinate, is, I think, very well worth looking up. I mean, really, the heart of these three items on this slide are the important need to value learner voices, to ensure that the voices from marginalised communities do get heard, seminars, publications, public advocacy. And academics can give authority and energy and support and editing and peer reviewing to all of that, to ensure that this stuff doesn't remain eccentric and marginal. Can I have the next one, please? And the point I'm making there is, there used to be an Oxfam poster in the 70s, which I always thought this captured very well, that until the lions have their own historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunters. And I feel that's another risk for us as educators, that we make sure it's the voice of the people we're speaking with and on behalf of that get really well heard. Okay, next one, please. So then, of course, we can teach, offering accessible curricula inside and outside the academy, arguing what do we want and how do we get there in workshops, looking at the current challenges we've got, where do they come from and what can be done about them, using different forms, MOOCs, so the spasm of the last half decade, but partnership with broadcasters. I mean, even though social media is dominant, broadcasting still has a way of setting national agendas and can inspire people to see how learning transforms their sense of the world. Teaching in unfamiliar places, football stadia, pubs, care homes, and so on, it's back to place in a way. And looking, as I said before, to find new patterns of provision, less simply grounded in the certificated and progression-driven work of our mainstream activity. And can I have the next slide, please? So it's more or less the end. And a particular form of teaching is the education and training of activists, of the people we were working alongside, giving them the technical skills for being trainers and developers themselves, and using tools from the theatre of the oppressed, or running schools for radicals, popular planning I mentioned, working with trade union studies, women's studies grew out of this, and using our spaces to give people opportunity to work out what it is that they want to do and say. Conscientizing other university staff. At Wolverhampton, we put out a survey to capture all the involvement with learning outside in the community of all the people who worked in our university, whatever their functions, academic, non-academic. And of course, it's a very rich picture that emerges of things that are explicit, helping teaching extramurally, or supporting primary schools, or running scout groups, or working with faith organizations, or learning themselves new skills, whether that's how to drive, or a whole variety of things that people were engaged in doing. And feeding that back to the university gives people a sense that we're more than formal organized courses, and our dialogues with the communities in which we live are more complex than that. And I think that's part of a precondition of trying to make this set of agendas belong to a wider group of people. Celebrating diversity of learners and people involved in learning. I mean, a lot of my working life has been involved with organising festivals, posh frock days, to celebrate existing learners as a way of encouraging other people to join in, to change the metaphor away from educations for other people to, as my mother said when I took her to an event once, here she's just like me, and I could do it too. Conferences, of course, the issue about hosting, about using our spaces because we're resource rich to offer space for other people to come and organize their own meetings, building trust, and running outreach centers. Above all, innovation, being creative, and having fun. I have just one more slide, which isn't me pontificating, but as a stimulus to the conversation we'll have, and looking at how pretty disastrous our response to the global pandemic has been, at least if you contrast Europe with a country like Vietnam or New Zealand. How do we find and share effective responses? And in particular, what do you do to engage in the education of anti-vaxxers, deniers of science? And what allies might we work with in that direction? Well, that's my thrum halfpenny. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you indeed. And I think these reflections are making our minds to provide questions and comments. Carmen just put to the chat that listening to Alan makes me remember the results of UCEN's recent projects, and it is very true. The real key and challenge is to make policymakers to push for a change and enable things to happen. How can we encourage policymakers to make the move? Carmen's question is there. Do you have a response to this, Alan? We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Yeah.
I clicked the mute button on my picture and not where I should have, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I spent most of my life trying to answer that question. And I suppose the heart of it is policymakers aren't going to listen to you if you haven't got people with you. So the things I've been talking about are really the preconditions. Of course, you help shape the arguments that are to be used in making this kind of a case to policymakers. But if the answer is more university lifelong learning education, the last people to argue for it are academics. The people who need to argue for it are your partners from the kind of work I've been describing. And I mean, policy change happens usually on a very incremental basis. But in the present dominance of neoliberal thinking, I mean, a key point for us is highlighting all the time the price of not having a more inclusive set of policies. And in that respect, we can engage in the kind of, what I was saying, conferences and seminars in which you bring mildly sympathetic or neutral policymakers into contact with the arguments for a more inclusive, a more diverse, a more respecting of difference form of education, and to understand the price of policies that produce the kind of alienation we see with the rise of populism across. And clearly that's harder to do in Hungary, where the populists have the state, than it is to make as an argument in countries where populism is emerging, growing, is worrying, but isn't yet a dominant force. I should have said Britain as well as Hungary. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. There are quite a number of questions, just trying to keep the lines before giving floor to Heribert. There were some previous questions, one from Alfredo Soiro from Portugal. To enhance role of higher education institutions, would it be useful to have a competence framework of citizenship, ethics, and social responsibility to include in the program learning outcomes?
Yeah, I think process is what really matters. And whenever we identify ahead what the outcomes are going to be, we delimit ourselves to teaching what we test or what we expect to resolve. So it isn't that I don't think we shouldn't identify them, I do think we should, but that we shouldn't then work in a way simply to produce the outcomes that we want to secure. I think we have to be confident to work alongside people and for the process to emerge as we go along. I think the Latin American thinkers are far, far more developed in their thinking than our own work is in this. And I like the way Latin American academics move between the popular and the scientific in a powerful complementary way.
Thank you. Heribert, you raised your hand, so do you have a question to Ellen? Please, we can hear you.
I just wanted to comment a few points which Ellen was suggesting, and I will try to look into some of them on Wednesday. I think explicitly what he raised in respect to the SDGs, I think we should look a bit into it. There's the other process of UNESCO, which for adult learning and education is Confintea, and of course they have their higher education also. So let's look at some of the linkages. And this argument from Ellen, please liaise with those specialist institutions for citizenship. I will try to look into an example from Germany with our federal institution, which is looking and preparing all the documents for citizenship education. And finally, I think what I will do is take up, when you were arguing the 1919 report from Britain, I think I'll take it up with the 1919 when adult learning and education became part of the German constitution, and then look where we have reached now when 10 millions are coming into the local centers and how much of that is related to active citizenship. So maybe this is an idea how I will look into it, some as a taking it up from what you just rightly said. And thank you, Sir Alan, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you for the comment, Heribert. There was a question from Christina Paulus before getting to Susan. Christina Paulus indicated, could the SDGs give another motivation to become more active as a university?
Well, they certainly should give us a framework for conversations across the institution, shouldn't they? That if you're thinking about anti-poverty strategy, then that has to involve the scientists and the economists, as well as the educators. And I mean, those kind of dialogues, certainly in my institution, those kind of conversations happen. I won't say that they then lead to any really effective cross-sectoral cooperation, because we've got very powerful dynamic forces of performativity that squeeze people's heads, squeeze people's belief about what time they have to give to something. And I suppose what I have been arguing for, and it's easier to argue it, frankly, to adult educators than to academics more broadly, is that that's the precondition for a society we would want to live in, that we learn to combine our activities across the piece. I mean, it is slightly easier with the SDGs and the pandemic to see that there is no way you can solve the issues about changing patterns of behavior without bringing together the rigor of people who know, who've researched the findings on what works, with people who can make that accessible to people in conversations and dialogues on the ground. And I do see our role. I mean, I did start by saying fighting for a university-wide view seems to me a really important part of our work, just as Carme was saying, fighting to influence policymakers, because policy's everywhere. It's the approaches our academic leaders take to experimental work that doesn't directly lead either to the funding for the university or for points you can score on league tables. It's in those spaces that the new forms and solutions that will help us address the find solutions to our problems. Yeah.
Thank you. Susan Paul in Susan in Palm City puts the question: Can you give an example of when you or your colleagues perhaps used a pub or other unusual place to teach? How did you encourage people to attend?
Well, if you're going to a place where people already go, it's a lot easier than having an empty room and asking them to come to it. I mean, the context I was thinking of first was an initiative in a pub in the Midlands in Britain where we organised an initiative called A Pint and a Prospectus. So as you bought alcohol, you also got an encouragement. Here's the list of things we'll be doing upstairs in a spare room in the pub over the next fortnight. It's a way of getting people to put a toe in the water. And a woman who, I mean, you need community activists committed to be your partners in this. It's a woman running a fish and chip shop in a really rundown area of South Manchester, whose staff said, do you know, I'm sure we could sell more fish and chips if you'd give us a bit of training. So she said, go on then, I'll do it, because they're worried about the disappearance of, in a declining area, of people turning up. So she did that, and she said, God, it had a fantastic impact. I thought, well, if that's true for my staff, I wonder if it's true for the wider society. She used an empty building next door and opened it up with a few computers in it to create a community center. It's totally regenerated that area itself. It is a wonderful kind of illustration of, if you leave the space for people's creativity, and we can provide the kind of the resources which are marginal to our activity. They can be the things not at the center of what we're needing to fight for resources for, can make a profound difference in an excluded community. And once people build trust with you, it's like heroin, you know, whoomph, there's an adrenaline rush, and then you can't. Your world is transformed for you as well as for them. It's my experience. That, I mean, really, that's what I spent most of my life trying to do. And then I came into academia and tried to write about it. Much less success, of course.
Thank you for the response. Fergal Finnegan from Ireland, University of Maynooth, indicated that this input of yours, making hope practical and despair unconvincing. If the labor movement and the new social movement were central to the type of adult education you describe, what actors and agents should we be looking towards today in our view?
That's a really good question, and I mean the answer's different in different places. If you live in the States, where there are relatively few people are organized into unions, you'd be looking for what are the other places in the world, around the world of work, in which people are associate with one another. How is it that you see the build the alliance with the gradations of more senior colleagues? But you can find in where there are trade unions, where there are trade associations, where there are people with a passion for a particular problem in the area in which they live, people who are worried about pollution, people who are worried about where the jobs are going to come from the day after tomorrow. I mean, as AI, well, I think my own experience of this is extraordinary, really. I mean, I'm a completely soft and floppy adult educator. I'm at the community end of the business. The World Economic Forum come along and say, we want an adult educator to join our futures group. And I said, well, you won't want me because I'm the soft and floppy end. They said, no. Of course, the truth is what we have is at the cutting edge of the sort of educational industrial change that produces the kind of new economic possibilities for firms facing the end of a particular technology. And it's not that they all disappear, but that if you're faced, I found this with what used to be polytechnics in Britain, faced with closing a department or falling in love with adult education. They fell in love with adult education, and firms can be the same. So I would say, talking to where we don't have an organized labor movement, looking at the people who are most likely to be worried about the sets of challenges that I threw up at the beginning and looking for them as allies. But I do think workers are also parents. They're also people concerned with their environment, and you can get at it that way around if you can't the other. But I do think trade unions' future lies in facilitating learning as a key industrial skill, and so does the ILO in that argument that lifelong learning should be a universal right, and life-wide as well as lifelong. Sorry.
Yeah, you're very, very true.
Soft and floppy answer, really.
This is also interesting to visit or revisit ILO's recent paper on the future of work. And I think their position on why to integrate lifelong learning into better understanding labor organizations and to give them a good chance to change and all prepare for change in a collaborative manner. I think that's important.
Yeah, and I do too. And the key is, it's the first of their recommendations. Yeah, you're invited indeed to talk about the future of work, and your key recommendation is lifelong learning for all. And I think all, not just the posh and the clever.
And it is something where universities have a significant role. It's not just a citizenship to be bridged towards university lifelong learning, but also to get these focuses of employability and community action.
Yes.
And I think the bridge is, one of the composite thing here is participation, anyhow.
Yeah, and for the university, there's a very easy role, challenging but easy, for enabling people to progress who are ready for what a university can already do. The issue is to rediscover the creativity that was there in early extramural or outreach work, of making that work accessible to people who are going to be a long way away from the academy as participants, as signed up on a degree program.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. And right now, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, let us have a look into this menti.com, what kind of elements we have collected. And I just try to upgrade the content. Some people sent in their findings, and I just try to share with you this in a second. Not very easy. Can you see the screen itself?
Yeah, yeah.
I hope you can see the screen. So these are the notions that we have so far collected regarding the topic. I hope it can develop a little bit during the week. And for the end of today's session, may I ask Carmen, I'm going to stop sharing here. May I ask Carmen to project the week's program, and this is what we would like to remind ourselves, that the week is going to continue with a couple of inputs from different partners. So tomorrow we meet again at 12 o'clock, where Dr. Dorothy Schulte and Professor Mepine Makoe will discuss accessibility and inclusivity in higher education, the impact of COVID-19. On Wednesday, we will meet again with Professor Hinson to discuss active and global citizenship, international commitments and practical examples. Thursday will be dedicated to colleagues providing an input from Belgrade. Professor Katarina Popovic and Dr. Maja Maksimovic will discuss students and community engagement in civic education, the case of the Faculty of Philosophy in the University of Belgrade in Serbia. And finally, on Friday, we will meet to discuss our findings, rethinking lifelong learning in the scope of active and global citizenship for the next decade. Thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you very much, Professor TUCKETT, to have shared with us your views and approaches to citizenship, active citizenship, and the role of higher education. Thank you very much to the participants. Thank you so much indeed, and let's keep in touch. You will find these presentations uploaded at the Open Fora, and I would like to thank for the UCAN office for the technical preparations and inviting participants. I wish you a nice afternoon. Take good care indeed. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.